The topic that we're going to tackle today is actually of particular interest, and it's the topic of family cohesion. Why does it attract your attention in particular?
What really differentiates high functioning multi-generational families from those that are less functioning or from those that cease to exist is their high level of cohesion and the level of effort they put into nurturing and maintaining this cohesion. And another part of it was that a dear colleague and friend of mine, Torsten Pieper, has done some amazing research on cohesion. So when we started working on other topics, he brought this to my attention and it just clicked for me. It's like, this makes sense. This is a key driver of family connection to one another, to the business, and really a lever that we should be using also in our advisory practice.
When you talk about cohesion to your colleagues, to your academic colleagues, to your families that you consult, how do you define it? Like, what does that look like for you, family cohesion?
You can experience a sense of cohesion not just with your family, with any group, with your spouse, with friends, whatever. But what it is in a group is that people feel a sense of connectedness and belonging to that group more than to the outside.
What are the contributing factors to family cohesion eroding in the first place?
Cohesion naturally, if in a healthy functional family, yes, you'll have cohesion over time. As the family, again, causing consortium, people, they move away, so you're geographically dispersed. If you have a business that's in one place, people are automatically going to have less exposure to the business. They're going to know less of it. They're going to feel less connected to it unless you specifically counteract and create opportunities for family members to come in and stay connected to the business. And then another thing that can really harm this or accelerate this fragmentation and the family drifting apart is when families develop a strong branch mentality. So when they no longer think about, we are one family, but we are a collection of branches.
At the beginning you explained that conflict will obviously always be part of it, like even in the most, like, the greatest family cohesion, like, is part of your culture, you'll still have conflict. So what are the telltale signs for you? And secondly, and I think it's basically the same question, who's in charge of that? Like, who should take responsibility? Like, who should be advocating the family cohesion the most?
Conflicts are, I mean, what are conflicts? They're just disagreements, right? And when we can see disagreements as disagreements, that is a telltale sign of there not being an underlying issue. If they're, oftentimes in conversations when other things pop up or the severity of the response doesn't match the issue, then that's a pretty good indicator that there's something else going on. So we talk about an underlying issue. I think to your second question, I think everybody has a role in nurturing family cohesion.
Very concretely here, Claudia, we're asking for advice. Like, what is your advice to sort of like, really stimulate family cohesion?
Cohesion work is not, a feel good exercise for the family. Cohesion work is something that you do to ensure the continuity and the well being and the prosperity of your business and the well being of your constituencies. The way in which you do it can look very, very different in many families.
There's another big paradigm shift that we know, and it's just a fact that even a few decades ago, there just weren't as many women involved actively in recognized roles in the family enterprise or around family wealth as there are today. Do you feel that's another factor that might influence in future, like, how we approach, how we talk about family cohesion, etc.? Do you think it will be more enabling or like less enabling, or do you think it's going to be always the same challenge for families to have this conversation?
That's something to be super mindful of, right? Who does the invisible work? And that I think is something that families that do this really well, they acknowledge people, and those are often women that are maybe not operationally involved in the business, but that are, just family members. They value these women's or men, these people's contribution for what they do behind the scenes in terms of keeping the family together. Because again, everyone has a responsibility to create and nurture cohesion, but some will do it better than others.
I think you're touching upon something that I find is so key, though. It's like, and whether it's a governance document or anything else in relation to the family enterprise, whether it's you telling the story, whether you're making a film about it, whether you're recording the history, the language that's being used for that, I agree with you, is totally key because that makes it either inclusive or not, right? Like it makes it either marginalizes certain people or it doesn't. But most of all, it glorifies certain people over others. But really, we also know that one of the biggest sort of like family cohesion pillars in a lot of family businesses is just the story of the founder. And when that, right, like when you, the more you get away from that in terms of time, I guess like it becomes harder also to relate to that. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. Families need to find other ways to relate to each other and sort of like become more flexible in that term of inclusion.
That's one thing with everyone glorifies storytelling, right? And researchers love storytelling. Oh, it's so wonderful. Sure, that's fine, but let's talk about the stories that are not being told, right? Why are we telling the stories, the same stories, over and over and over again about certain people in our ancestry, emitting, maybe less favorable outcomes of our history? Because those stories would be important to tell too. How have we grown? How have we evolved through our missteps? But oftentimes these stories are swept under the rug.
I'm sorry to put it that way, but that's also kind of like, I guess, the patriarchy in research, if we want to talk about that, right? Like, because I actually think like a lot, and that's, I think, where the emergence of women in more active and more visible roles is an interesting phenomenon in the family enterprise. And again, I think within the family enterprise, this is not so much a feminism discussion or a glass ceiling discussion as you're born into a family enterprise. It's a circumstance of birth, right? Like it's not like you chose that, that just happens to you, right? Like now, but what happens next is really instrumental, right? Like, because I always say there's so many women and men, actually, any family member, any number of family member who've done extraordinary things for their family enterprises, who've made huge sacrifices. And as you said, they went to silent graves. And now they might have preferred it that way, they might have wanted it, but they might have also never known that they actually had something to share. And I agree with you, there's this cult around the personality cult, like the most charismatic family member gets the most attention, or like, the most vocal one gets the most attention. And if you want to work as a system, though, I guess like shining that spotlight really on everyone that's there, like in whichever capacity, becomes almost like an imperative, right? Like if you don't want to create that type of resentment over the long run.
Yeah, I love that. And, in conjunction with that, so you say they go to a silent grave, but what happens to their offspring? Because they know they have their own narratives and they're like, how does nobody talk about what they did,
What they
what
did,
our,
yeah. Mm.
yeah. And that creates resentment. And that can be the root of a super negative branch dynamic that just creates, that ends up in the courtroom essentially.